I'm Michael Kende, this is Shahan. We're with Analysys Mason Consulting. The question we want to look at today is the difference between fiber versus low Earth orbit, or LEO satellite. What is the most economically efficient way to deliver quality broadband for all, meaning mainly now starting to look at the really very rural areas. And this is a question that policymakers are, or at least should be asking themselves as they're trying to allocate scarce resources to connecting everyone to high-speed internet, whether that's the US BEAD program or the Digital Decade in the EU or other programs around the world. So what we're going to do is a very high level in this lightning talk, compare quickly some of the characteristics of fiber versus LEO, starting with what is the basic characteristics of each. So in this slide basically looks at fiber, which is really the gold standard, and it looks at what are the costs, and fiber basically has very high upfront costs, but then very low operating costs. And the upfront costs are really coming from connecting one local exchange. There's some shared links, but then you have to connect every house, whether it's aerial or door-to-door underground, but you have to connect every house, so that can be quite expensive. But the trade-off is that you have very high speed, up to 2 gigabits per second. And then, of course, there's a question, does everybody need that? Now, in rural areas, this turns into very, very high costs because there's relatively little shared, because there's fewer houses, and then the distances that need to be connected are much further with the fiber. So that's very high costs, again, if you have to connect every house. And where there's relatively little middle mile from the local exchange to points of presence to get access to the rest of the internet, the costs can get quite high. Next. So that's different than LEO satellites, which where the cost to serve each household is relatively constant and doesn't change much across different types of areas. So what you have with LEO is, if you look at the red line, you go from a ground station to this constellation, and then it goes along, and then it beams down to a house or a residence with the red line. And the total capacity that you can deliver is constrained by the amount of spectrum you have and the number of satellites. The more satellites passing, the more spectrum, the more you can deliver. Now, the key is that, unlike fiber, the cost per user is not affected by the location. Whether these satellites are passing over New York City or Wyoming or any other rural area, the cost is the same. What differs, though, is the user experience, because if you're going over New York City and you have a lot of people sharing the same beam, they're going to get less capacity, and apparently Starlink is already starting to limit to some degree the number of subscribers in cities. But of course, that's not going to be an issue in rural areas where you have far fewer users and fewer businesses using the LEOs.
Thanks, Michael. Next slide, please. Yeah, so now that we've covered some of the basic characteristics of fiber and LEO satellites, we can compare them head to head. And here, 3 important considerations are population density, performance requirements, as well as investment time frame. So as Michael mentioned, in urban areas, fiber tends to be more economically efficient because of the short distances between homes. But as you get into more rural areas, the cost increases significantly, which means that their LEO becomes more cost effective. In terms of performance requirements, what you'll hear typically is that fiber is more able to consistently provide higher speeds than LEO. But that said, LEO is able to provide speeds of up to 200 megabits per second, which is already double what the FCC considers a good benchmark in terms of quality broadband. So really, both of these technologies are able to deliver good broadband for everyone. But what about the longer term, right? So in the longer term, one of the main benefits of fiber is that it has a very long asset lifespan. So once it is already in the ground, the cost to then upgrade these networks to the next generation of fiber technology tends to be quite low. Whereas when you think about satellites, these would typically require a more frequent replacement over time, which means that if you consider a longer time horizon, LEO may start to look a little bit more expensive. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we can do an exercise to basically estimate what an optimal split between sort of fiber and LEO in a market would be by calculating the expected return per home under different scenarios. So if you just look, for example, on the chart on the left, what we have here is the expected return per home for fiber and LEO across differently populated areas. So if you see across the bottom, you have population density going from urban to rural. And essentially, the expected returns per home for fiber decline over time because in rural areas, the cost is significantly higher. Whereas, as Michael mentioned, for LEO, the cost doesn't really vary depending on the population density. So at some point, these lines intersect, and between that and sort of the most rural home in the market, you would have the sort of region within which LEO would be more viable than fiber. Now, you can use this framework and basically vary some of the considerations that we had that I described in the earlier slide. So, for example, if you look at a different or sort of a lower target in terms of what you hope the appropriate speed should be, what this would do is it effectively means that your LEO constellation will be able to serve more users if everyone uses a slightly lower speed. This increases the expected return for LEO, and therefore makes a larger percentage of the market more viable for LEO relative to fiber. So this is relatively illustrative at the moment, but we are looking to publish some work looking at this in more detail within the next couple of weeks. So if this is something that's of interest to you, please get in touch with us after this. And thanks very much, everyone, for your time.